Welcome Dr. Iacovone to the screen.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure you can hear me. If you don't tell me no, I will continue because I assume the connection
We can
is
hear
fine.
you fine. You can start.
Great. Thank you. So thanks a lot for inviting me. And I will talk in this presentation. I will discuss the issue of managerial practices. And I will present some of the research that I've been involved, but I also will just give you a little bit more of a broader view about this topic. And I'll connect to the intervention and impact evaluation that I've been involved and other researchers. So this is the outline of my talk. I'll present why motivated this research. I'll discuss a little more about data, and I think it's important because the availability of data has actually changed the way we look at this problem. Present them based on those existing data, some stylized fact, talk about what we think may be determining these managerial abilities, and then talk a little more about experiment and how we potentially could go after about improving. And the starting point here is that we observe large and persistent difference in productivity, which are across country, which are clearly associated to difference in income per capita, GDP per worker. So the interesting point is that actually this persistent difference in productivity do not only arise between countries, but also within country. Here I'm showing you two graphs where I'm showing the distribution of productivity in the US, the red line, and in Mexico are the other two smaller line. The point that I want to be made here is that first of all, even in the US, there is very large and persistent productivity, but also in the developing country, these gap sort of in productivity are even larger than in developed countries. So if anything, this issue of firm productivity heterogeneity is a big issue in developed countries, but even more in developing countries. Important point I want to make here is that often when we think about production function, when we think about productivity and technology, we typically think about sectors. And the point I want to make in these slides is that if we look at difference in a simple measure of productivity, such as value added per worker, but the same picture would come up if I showed you the total factor productivity. When we look at difference between sectors, in this case, comparing difference between the sector at 4 digits, these differences are actually, if anything, smaller than difference when we look within very narrow sector at 6 digits. So on the right side, you have the distribution of productivity of firms within a very specific narrow sector in Mexico, cut and sew apparel, so very, very specific narrow activities. And on the left, instead, we have the difference across different sectors, 4 digits, like production of shirts versus shoes making, etc. So bottom line is that these underlying micro differences are larger at the firm level than actually, or certainly not smaller at firm level than between sectors. Now, when we think of this concept of productivity, what is behind it? And clearly, there is a large literature that looks at productivity as technology, that looks at organization of firms, but more recently, there's been a lot of focus on this issue of managerial practices and on the side on incentives, but I focus now on the managerial practice. In a way, I could tell you the story of this sort of presentation in a picture. On sort of the left side, you have a firm, which is a plant in the US that you can see there. And on the right side, there is a plant in India. So what you can see is difference in all sorts of dimension. There are some differences clearly in capital, but the biggest difference are in the way plant and worker are operating. A difference in safety equipment, in the way monitoring is done. You can see behind there is a whiteboard where monitoring is done is continuously. And these differences arise from the fact that certain companies have developed and have invested significantly in the organization. So just for the records, the plant on the left is actually Toyota, one of the Toyota plants in the US. Now, the importance of management and how we organize production has a very long tradition in economics. So going back to Adam Smith, he pointed out to the idea that management matters a lot in determining productivity. It is all this observation about the pin factory. Also, already in 1887, there's an article of Walker in the first number of QJ, where he kind of points to the fact that the difference between certain firms realizing profits and others not realizing profits, or certain firms realizing colossal profits, is very much around, it talks about managerial ability, it's very much about the way the firms get managed and organized. Now, it's a very nice recent article in 2011 on the Journal of Economic Literature that reviews all this literature, and he makes the argument that sort of management and organization is one of those driving factors that for which there is a very high ratio of speculation to empirical study and finding. And the reason was that for a long time we didn't have data that would allow us to analyze this management and organization. Now, thanks to the effort of a number of researchers, in this case, I'm projecting the collection or data collection on a number of countries from the World Management Survey done by Nick Bloom, John Van Ryn, and a number of researchers working with them. And some of this, for example, in Latin America or Africa, has been collected also support of the World Bank. And now, the important point is that we have data on firms and management across the world in a way that can be compared and systematized. There are alternative ways of measuring management. I'm going just to mention this for the record. So there is this approach pioneered by Bloom and Van Ryn, where they basically use this survey over the phone that are open-ended, and they focus mostly on 4 areas. So management of the operation, performance, monitoring, target setting, and talent management. They actually continue work on this and have worked with the Census Bureau on the approach to measure management, much more using survey in a much cheaper way that can allow a significantly larger sample. Then there's work by David McKenzie and Chris Woodruff that basically have focused on a way to measure management more for micro firms, focusing on marketing, stock management, financial management, and record keeping. And these are typically simple questions that can be asked to micro firms. So what are all these data collection, what we have learned? The first point is that quality of management, it's very heterogeneous across countries, and it's clearly worse in developing countries. And you can see your countries in Africa and poorer countries tend to have a poorer level of management. However, spread between firms, actually, it's even bigger than spread between countries. And you can see here, on the left, you have the spread between micro and small firms, and this was data were collected by David McKenzie and Chris Woodruff. On the right, you have more medium to large firms, and based on the World Management Survey. And what you can see is that this issue of spread and different management level across different firms occurs in all sorts of countries. So it's not just a feature of, say, developing countries, but also richer countries such as US, Germany, Japan, etc. Now, an interesting point here is that it seems that there is some issue with information. Firms do not seem to realize how bad they are, or at least managers do not seem to realize that actually they are not managing very well their company. So what you have here is actually the correlation between the management that is measured through this performance measured from the World Management Survey, and actually the self-score that a manager gives to their own company. So you can see basically correlation is very low. There are some countries where actually self-score is much higher than actually the average score. And this is at the country level. This is basically at the firm level on the left. Basically, it's the same correlation between firm management perception and reality. So you can basically see that, broadly speaking, the relationship is fairly flat. And there is a typical over-optimism of managers. They think they are much better than typically tend to be. This is especially so in poor countries. The other important fact is that this managerial gap seems to matter for a great deal for productivity. There is this work by Bloom and other. They show that they kind of can explain up to 35%, up to a third of the income gap between countries with difference in management. So difference in management matters a lot for income, for welfare. Now, at the firm level, what we can see here is that management is correlated with all number of performance measures. So this is on the horizontal axis. What you have is a measure of management that's increasing. Basically, firms are being by decile of how good is the quality of their management. And you can see that when firms have a better management, they have higher productivity, they have higher profits, they have higher growth, they tend to patent more, they do more investment in R&D, they are more likely to be exporters. And this is the case that we previously came a picture from the US. I could show you the exact same picture for a number of other countries. But this is also the case for micro firms, where also we could think that if a firm is very small, then actually management doesn't matter very much. But actually here is the point that even firms that are less than 5 employees, which this survey are based, show that management matters a lot and is correlated with performance. In this case, a measure of performance is monthly sales in these firms. Interesting aspect for those concerned about climate change and mitigation type of measures is interesting work that shows that actually management may also be important for firms' capacity to reduce pollution and manage scarce environmental resources. So here you see this correlation between energy intensity at the firm level and actually management score. An important point is that often is made is that there's some sort of differentiation between promoting management as a basic things and actually promoting innovation as something much more high-end. And a lot of countries seems to be fascinated with the high-end things, and they don't just care a lot too much about this basic more management. A point here by research of a colleague at the World Bank, Bill Maloney and Javier Sirera, shows that actually management quality is actually key for innovation. So if you want to invest in innovation in your country, it's also important, and you promote innovation, it's also important to think about how management improves, because management kind of set the base for innovation. This is cross-country evidence, but I have done some work also in Mexico that shows a very tight correlation between management and innovation, and also sort of some evidence that this relationship actually is causal, going from good management into higher likelihood of innovation. Now, this is very recent work from a colleague of mine at the World Bank, Javier Sirera and co-authors, and they show that in the case of Brazil, in the context of the COVID shock, actually better managed firms seems to be more likely to do things that we think are important. So what are these things? For example, they're more likely to adopt health measures, they're more likely to use digital technology, and actually they're more likely to do all a number of changes, such as sitting back with their suppliers and trying to renegotiate because the situation has actually changed. So point being is that management can also be very important in the context of this very big exogenous shock where firms have to react and respond. What explains now poor management? And one of the finding of work I've been doing is that market integration and market access, it's an important driver of this. So here we show you the map of Mexico and the manufacturing plant and the quality of their management. So what you see darker shade means better managed firms. So what we find, and we do this much more rigorously in the paper, in the next slide I'll show it, firms that are in manufacturing, they sort of, when they are closer to a market that is important, like the US, especially if they are exporter, they tend to have much stronger quality of management. Being closer to the US market does not matter for services, or does not matter so much. What matters actually is being in a very thick and rich market. So management is good in the right side for services company around big and deep and competitive potentially market. I'll show you here basically in a regression format what I showed you before, that actually the firms that are closer to the border are better management, so distance from the border reduce the quality of the management, and this is especially so for sectors that are more integrated in the US. So that basically firms that are in sectors that are more integrated because they export more, this distance to this market matters even more. So being in large competitive market and generate certain incentive for firms to invest in management. Competition seems to be another factor. This is work done by Nick Bloom and John Van Ryn, and they sort of add different measures of competition and how this actually influences management. And somehow, seems to be that also how market function and misallocation has an important influence on returns to management. So here, what I'm showing you, it's basically the relationship between management and employees, in a way to think of it as returns to management in terms of size. So in the US, this is the red line and the red dot. The returns sort of to good management is relatively steep. In Mexico manufacturing, it's flatter, but Mexico manufacturing is much more integrated to the US than services sector, where this line is much, much flatter. So point is that even if you improve management in the services company in Mexico, that doesn't correlate with the significant improvement in employees. So sort of pointing to potential that maybe there's some issue about misallocation. Market share don't get allocated because you are a good firms, but maybe for potential other reasons. Closely related to that sort of potential findings is this finding where we look at the relationship between age and management in terms of averages and in terms of spread. So let me clarify what these two pictures try to do. On the left, we have average management by firm cohort. So we have firms that are young, between 1 and 5 years old, firms that are 6 to 10, 11 to 15 years old, and everything is relative to just created firms, just born in the year where the survey is done. So what we see in the US, this is the red again, is that through cohort, sort of management kind of increases, and certainly it's much better the quality of management once you have gone beyond year 5. So in a way, the idea is that this is very consistent with this model where a firm industrial model where firms are born and they don't know how good they are. The entrepreneur doesn't know how good his company is, so he tries something, and if the market works well, they stay, survive, and they grow. But if they don't, then basically they're going to exit. So in a way, if you compare very young firms with others, you should see this distinct difference in management quality. And in case of Mexico, in services, which is the green line, actually, this is the opposite. What we see is that as firms grow older, in the older cohort, we see management being poorer quality. When we look at the spread, what this model would predict, a good, well-functioning market would suggest that when firms are born, because they don't know very well how good they are, there's a lot of spread. There are some firms that are good, some firms that are bad. They don't yet understand how good or bad they are. So there is a lot of persistence of spread at early ages. But then as time passes, if these firms are bad, markets should kind of push them to exit, or firms need to improve. So we should see that the spread in management reduces. And this is exactly what we see in the US. The red on the right, the sort of spread between management score decreases among older cohort. And instead, we don't see that in Mexico. Actually, we see that basically in services, the spread in managerial score increases, meaning when we look at older cohort established firm, there is much more heterogeneity in management than among the younger cohort, which is very surprising and inconsistent with a model where markets are functioning well, and potentially may sort of be telling us something about the existence of misallocation. Another interesting result is the importance of who manages the firm. So we see that firms that are professionally managed, they seems to be much better managed than firms that are owned by family and managed within the family, which is basically the omitted category relative to which we are comparing. So you can see the problem seems to be not necessarily the ownership, not necessarily the fact that the owner is a family, but is actually who manages it. So the sort of point being is that if you are restricted to choose as a manager someone from your family, or even worse, if you're restricted to use as a manager your first son, it's likely not to be the best choice, because maybe he's a great manager, but chances are that he may not be the best manager that if you were choosing from a much larger pool of professional managers. Now, why firms resort to this use of family manager? Are they being irrational? Some work that I've done with Bill Maloney and Nick Tsivanidis suggests that actually this may be driven by incentive. So what we find is that in places where there is weak rule of law, low trust, owners of firms prefer choosing a manager from the family versus choosing an external manager because they can trust the manager from the family. So it's actually really a regulatory environment that generates a certain incentive in the trust environment to adopt certain managerial, to make certain managerial decision and keep the business within the family. Education also seems to be important. This is work looking at the US and sort of places that were the location where there was a land grant or there's a high share of business degrees, and they seems to that those locations seems to have, the firm seems to have better management. So the availability of business schools seems to be, and education seems to be important. Now, we've seen management matters. We saw a number of characteristics that seems, or determinants seems to drive management. But the question is, as a policymaker, can we improve management? Can we do something that actually can make things better? And the bottom line from all the research is actually that yes, we really can, and we know there is a number of things that can be done to improve management. So first experiment I'm going to tell you is this work done in India and by Bloom, David McKenzie, and a number of the co-authors. What they work is textile company. What they work, these are textile company, relatively large, so typically 200, 250 employees. And they figure out that these companies are really badly managed. And what you can see here, for example, in terms of record keeping, they sort of record defects in a very non-standardized manner. They don't basically use this data. It's just written on a paper and nobody looks at it. Machine, there is no preventive management. Tools are left on the floor, then obviously it's going to be hard to find them. And they work with this company. And after an intervention that lasts about 6 months, I'm going to give you some more details now, the results are pretty impressive. So firms start getting managed very differently on the floor, but also in terms of performance monitoring. What they do in this intervention, they basically target specific practices and managerial practices in a number of areas that matter for this textile company. The implementation of intervention was done by an international consulting company called Accenture. So these are the area that they target, and they try to make sure that the firms implement these the managerial practices. And what are the results? The bottom line is the results is a very significant improvement in productivity, and basically this you can see here, the dark line is the treated plants and the red is actually the control. You see basically after a little more than a year, there is an improvement in productivity around 70%. And this improvement is driven by the adoption of practices. So you can see the adoption of practices. The blue is the treatment plants, the red are the control. All plants receive a diagnostic here. So what happens is that all plants improve a little bit, but then only the blue plants, the treated plants, get the support of consultant for 6 months to implement those practices. So the red improved because they realized after diagnostic something is wrong, but the blue really improved significantly more. What's very interesting is that this improvement, this difference in this improvement between treatment and control persists through time. So after 8 years, these managerial differences are still there. And what's interesting is that the owner of these firms that typically have multiple plants move and copy these good managerial practices from one plant to the other. So the treatment on experimental are plants that are owned by the same manager that owns the plant that got the treatment, but they are basically didn't get any treatment in the green plants, but they are copying some of the practices. What's interesting to see also, they don't continue all the practices, they only focus on those that seem to be working better for them. I've been working with David McKenzie and Bill Maloney in Colombia. We replicate this intervention with a local consulting company in a way that could be much cheaper at a fifth of the cost. And we did this even at an even cheaper cost. So the original intervention in India was about $150,000 at the market price. The one in Colombia is the consulting in Colombia is about 30,000. And then we tried to develop a model of management consulting that could be even cheaper, doing consulting in group. And this is at the cost of a third of the normal individual management consulting. What I show you here is the results on improvement of managerial practices. We have the before, so you see these three groups are the group before and they are identical. So we have the control group, the group that is the blue dashed. We have the individual, which is the red dashed, and the green is the group that receive group consulting. And what we see is that both group and individual consulting seems to be improving managerial practices. And this is about 12 months after they have been supported. And what happened to firm performance? What is the interesting finding here is that actually and what I'm showing here is the effect of the treatment during intervention and post-intervention. So the big result is that the cheaper consulting actually was to some extent more impactful than the more expensive individual consulting. In terms of employment, in terms of other performance measure that we have, sales, profit, value added. Now, in many cases, the difference between group and individual consulting in the post-treatment, they are not statistically different. So we cannot really say that individual consulting was not working, but we can say that actually the group consulting, many of the instances, is working better. The story we have is a story around uncertainty and getting information. What we see is that often firms don't adopt these practices because they don't know if the practice is good for them, or they don't fully trust this management consultant. In the context of the group consulting, what we see is that the firms observe each other, and when a managerial practice is adopted by most of the company in the group, so when the average of these managerial practices adoption is high, the other firms also are more likely to adopt it. So the way that we think is operating the mechanism is that by being in group, you are reducing your asymmetric information, you're concerned about these practices being good for you, that you're concerned about you being able to implement these practices. There are many ways to do consulting. I've been involved in a very recent project where we try to focus on alternative model of consulting, and I'm going to wrap it up in a couple of minutes. So what we find here is that we tested two alternative consulting approaches for retail business in Mexico. Approach number one was focusing on external consulting. So basically it was a menu of 20 organizational structure and practices that were visible to customers, very much customer driven, so marketing and stuff like that. And on the right side, the other intervention was actually practices that were much more focused on the inside operation of the plant, things such as restocking of the inventory, things as managing a relationship with suppliers, things like record keeping, and what we basically see is that basically we have these two very ways to approach management consulting, and for both we deliver this through 12 consulting sessions with some junior consultants that are supervised by more senior consultants. The intervention is obviously around Mexico City, and the bottom line of the result is that we see for both intervention similar impact in terms of increase in sales. And what we see is that intervention is very successful in terms of returns on investment. So basically you can pay back the cost of this intervention around 6 months, less than 6 months. What we find in the paper, for those interested, I can share it, is that the mechanism through which this consulting operates is very different. Consulting that goes through this external focus typically improves brand equity, which we measure through picture and through survey to customer. Consulting that instead focus on internal treatment improves not brand equity at all, but improves product management, which is measured through a double auditing process. There's a lot of more detail in the paper. Also, I want to just conclude that there is some evidence that not consulting, but potentially management can be improved through training. It's a very nice work by Steve Anderson, Bilal Zia, and other co-authors in South Africa, and they do some very focused, intensive training, some on marketing and on finance. And what they show is that when you do marketing training, this typically helps more smaller businesses, younger businesses that don't have a lot of big customer base. Instead, when you do financial training, this helps more businesses that already have some scale, they've already set a number of customers, they are older and more established, but they benefit a lot from this financial planning and efficiency organization type of training. So the point is that different intervention may be helpful for different type of firms. Concluding, I think it's very important to focus on management organization. We now have data and new instrument to measure credibly these concepts. I think we are starting to learn, thanks to this data, more about the determinants, and I think more can be done because it's an area that can have big returns in terms of policy advisory, in terms of research. I think we're also learning through this experiment, how can we improve it? And I think it's an area of great opportunity in experimentation, both in the private institution, but also in the public sector. There's a lot of research that looks at public institution, health, hospital, education, and also among NGO. I'll conclude here, and thanks for your attention.